And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Colleen Shogan. We're grateful for her leadership, her service, and her willingness to share her insights with us this evening.
Everyone, can you hear us okay in the back? Excellent.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dean Doug Ord, and welcome, Colleen. As Doug mentioned, I'm Diana Marsh.
Victoria Van Heining, hi.
And let's start here. So at the College of Information here at UMD, as Doug was alluding to, we're really proud of both the archives programs that we run and our kind of interdisciplinary and wide range of disciplines that our students and faculty come from to get into archives. I often joke that I'm a recovering anthropologist. Victoria comes from literature and English and history. We understand that you're a political scientist by training who's also done significant historical work. So we're wondering if you can start by telling us about that journey and what it was like for you to bridge these fields. And we think this might be of particular interest to our dual degree history and MLIS students.
Great, well, thank you. Thank you, Diana, Victoria, for having me here, of course, for the college and the dean as part of this lecture series. I think this all hatched when both of you came to a reception at the National Archives. I was still the Archivist of the United States, and it was mentioned, oh, could you come to University of Maryland? I said, yes, sure, let's do it. It took a little time. We had a few things happen in between, but yeah, I'm here, so it all worked out. So that's great. And yes, I'm glad to be back here in College Park because I spent so much time over at what was called Archives 2, the campus over in College Park, which is actually NARA's largest archival facility, and would try to work there. Ideally, I like to work out there once a week, but it usually translated into once every maybe 2 weeks because I was on the road so much when I was the archivist. But it was great to be out there, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the capabilities of that facility later in our conversation. But yes, I'm not an archivist. I usually say this first. I'm not an archivist by training. I'm not a librarian by training, but I am a political scientist. And I'm not really I'm not a recovering political scientist. Like I really am a political scientist. I teach at Georgetown in the government department. And, from time to time, I actually write things in political science. I just wrote something on the presidency that was published by The Contrarian earlier this week. So I love my discipline of political science. And I have had a really, strange, a circuitous route, I think you could say, in my career, a Byzantine route. And for any of the students that are in the audience who are thinking about what they're going to do with their lives and their careers, I think it's actually a good example because what you might start out doing may not be exactly what you end up doing, and that's a lot of fun. And if you're here you stay in this area, the Metro DC area, it's a great place to explore all kinds of different avenues because you have so many different opportunities to you. So I got a PhD in political science, and my first job was at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I arrived at George Mason in 2002. And I remember when I got that job coming out of graduate school, I was so excited. It was a tenure track job. I mean, it was, right outside of Washington, D.C., teaching American politics. I really thought to myself, this may be the only job that I ever have to apply for in my, or I ever have to get in my entire life. I may be certainly at George Mason for the rest of my career, and maybe I'll do different jobs there, but this is probably it. And I remember being really happy and excited about that. And it was a terrific faculty and great department at George Mason. But what happened was I was teaching at George Mason, both undergraduate and graduate students in political science, and I started to, when I would interact with students, I found out that I went straight through. So I went to graduate school, and then I ended up at George Mason. I was actually very young. I think I started teaching when I was 26. And, I had never taken time off for a lot of different reasons, but I hadn't taken time off to work in politics or work in government or any of those things. I was really well versed in the scholarly literature around the two institutions that I primarily taught, which was Congress and the presidency. But, you know, I hadn't worked in Congress or I hadn't worked in an executive branch or the White House or a department. But all these students, these great students at George Mason had, you know, they had all interned or they had worked there, they were working there if they were graduate students. And so I noticed there was just this little bit of a divide between us. And so there was a solution for that. There's the American Political Science Association Congressional Fellowship Program. And I knew about that program because one of my professors in graduate school was a product of the program, and I knew other people that were. So I said, I'm going to apply for this program and see if I could get this so I can take a year off of George Mason and go and work on Capitol Hill. I'll do that. And then I'll come back and my teaching will be improved and impacted, and maybe even some of my research trajectory. And so I went to Capitol Hill. I got the fellowship, which I was very grateful for. And I went to Capitol Hill. And I never went back. I never went back full time to teaching. I mean, I still teach. Like I said, I teach at Georgetown. I've been teaching there for over a decade. But I never went full time back to teaching at George Mason or in a political science department because it was just so damn exciting to be writing things. And I worked in the Senate, and I loved the pace. I loved working in an office. I had really smart colleagues in the office where I was working. It was thrilling. And I ended up actually staying in the Senate for another year and a half, or almost 2 years after the fellowship. I was offered a job and I left academia and stayed in the Senate. So that was the beginning of my public service. And after that, I went to the Library of Congress. I went to the Congressional Research Service, where I was for 8 years. Worked at CRS. What a great place. I mean, I thought I knew Congress before. I didn't know anything about Congress until I went to CRS, because instead of just working in one office, we worked for all offices. We worked for the House, we worked for the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, committee, leadership staff. So you were in and out of the entire institution. So after a while, you really start to understand how these things all work together or don't work together, and you really get an understanding of the rhythm of the place. I ended up becoming the deputy director of CRS and served in that capacity for close to 3 years. And then another crazy thing happened. That was at the time when James Billington was the Librarian of Congress at the Library of Congress. And he was nearing the end of his tenure. And he had decided that he was going to mix a few things up at the Library of Congress and create a whole new division or a whole new department of the Library of Congress that was going to focus on public programming and outreach and partnerships. And so I got a phone call one day at CRS from some of my friends who used to work at CRS, but then were up helping Dr. Billington in the librarian's office. And they said, Colleen, you got to come up to the 6th floor, which is where all the offices were. And like, I never went up to the 6th floor except to go to the cafeteria. So that was like immediately worrying at that point. And it's like being called to the principal's office. And I went up there and they said, well, we're starting this whole new division and we want you to come leave CRS for 6 months and come up and help run it. I said, oh, you see, I don't know anything about that. I'm a political scientist. I study Congress. Like, I do all this type of stuff. Like, I don't know National Book Festival programming. I don't know any of that stuff. And they said, no, you understand actually the bureaucracy and you understand how to move things through. You're really great in figuring out how to project manage things and move things through. So we want you to come up. We're going to have a woman that used to be a college president who's going to come up and run this, and you two are going to work together on it. And so I thought about it for a little bit, and these guys were my friends. Currently, the acting librarian of Congress, Robert Newland, was one of them. And I said, okay, I'll come up for 6 months and do it on a detail. And but then I'm coming back to my congressional thing. I kind of like it. And 3 months into it, I was asking whether I could be reassigned because I found this whole other world of the Library of Congress as a cultural institution. And I was taken by how exciting it was to be out there talking to people and interacting with the public and creating new and exciting partnerships that we could do all across the city and really across the United States and even the world. And that really changed my whole career trajectory, because then I started to learn, how do you manage a institution like the Library of Congress? What goes into that leadership? How is that, what are all the different things, all these different components that come together that is a complex institution like the Library of Congress? And I started to be part of some of that strategy at LOC. And that was also very exciting. Carla Hayden came in and she remixed things up again, and I went into a different, ended up as the assistant deputy librarian for a different set of programs for my last couple of years there. And it was a great learning experience, and also to understand the role of a nonpartisan federal library and what that looks like, and not just from the CRS perspective, but from the whole Library of Congress perspective.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in and follow up on that thread.
Sure.
And say, how does your training as a historian and a political scientist sort of color your understanding of archives and the role of archives in this political moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And a lot of people like, well, how did you even become the Archivist of the United States? And I think it's because I was a user of the archives. And that really goes into the next step in my career, which was at the White House Historical Association, where I went to manage all of the research at the White House Historical Association, all of their public programming. And of course, they're a nonprofit. They're not a government agency, but they're a nonprofit that works exclusively with the White House and tells the history of the White House and the stories of the people who lived and worked there. And a lot of my time at White House Historical was also using the resources like at the National Archives, at the Library of Congress, so we could tell these stories for a wider audience. And I certainly did that as a political scientist. When I taught the presidency course, I used all the presidential libraries for a lot of my research. And when you work with librarians and archivists, when you email them back and forth and you're looking for, a particular, either a really specific piece of information, which sometimes you're looking for just one thing that you're trying to chase down for a research project or paper, or you're just starting a research project or paper and the expanse is wide open to you and you're trying to figure out what your thesis is going to be or what the hook for the article or whatever you're writing. How you understand how librarians and archivists, or whoever you're working with, how they can be so instrumental to helping you in all stages of the research formation process and endeavor. So that's how I came into, at least initially, and certainly at CRS, we worked very directly with a lot of librarians at the Library of Congress as we were doing our research at CRS. So always intersecting with librarians and archivists in predominantly a research capacity, but then as I moved up into different management positions, being able to work with them directly alongside them on various projects.
I'm going to pick up another thread, if I may, which is, so you've talked about these two key audiences. So you have congressional research support, mostly engaging with staff and members and researchers. And then you've also talked about the role of your office and Dr. Billington sort of towards the end of his tenure, reaching out to a broader public. And of course, Dr. Hayden has taken that up to a whole other level, I guess it's fair to say. So can you talk to us a little bit about those two audiences? Are there overlaps in their needs and their interests? How do you support that broad range of users?
It's a difficult question because, when you manage a big place, either like the National Archives or the Library of Congress, you have all kinds of different populations or user groups that are coming to your institution for various reasons. I would put also teachers in as an important user group, the curious public, genealogists are a particular group. Then you have, your hardcore researchers that are either, maybe they're doing a dissertation, maybe they're writing an academic article or they're working on a book. Then you have creatives that are coming that are working on, fiction or plays or music or those types of things. So you have all of these audiences, and then like the public that are just coming to see what you have, and they're not sure exactly how they're going to use a complex place like the library or the archives. I mean, and I think Carla Hayden was in the same opinion as me, is that you always have to serve those researchers and at the Library of Congress, certainly members of Congress. Like that is a core constituency. Those are the people that are coming into your reading rooms. Those are the people that you're going to be working with on a routine basis. So you have to maintain excellent service to that population. But wouldn't it be great if, for example, like she said at the Library of Congress, that every American felt a connection with the Library of Congress, every American. And so while maintaining that level of service for the people that are routinely coming in, lining up. I used to see them at the National Archives lining up right at 8:30 at the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance to go up and to get their first pools of the day. Yes, but then how can I get more people into the research room? How can I get more people excited or interested in going to the National Archives catalog online? And that's by making engaging in-person experiences better, by improving your digital experience on the website. That's by even having the people that give tours, right, at the institution be engaging and trying to explain what services are available to Americans and how they can use these great institutions.
Great. Yeah. So I think you've touched on some of the leadership of Dr. Hayden and Dr. Lonnie Bunch, and you were all in your posts at this time of profound diversity in the leadership of our three largest GLAM organizations in the US and of course, really in the world. What was it like to be part of that trifecta? And were there some overlaps or differences in your leadership priorities for these different organizations insofar as you feel comfortable talking about?
Right. I mean, it was amazing. I will see pictures of the three of us together. They came to visit me after I was confirmed. They came to the archives, both of them, and we had lunch together in my office. And there's this great picture of us on the couch together in my office. I just love it. And we did 2 public programs, I think, the three of us together, where one was at Johns Hopkins, and then one was at the Library of Congress, actually. And every time that I appeared with them, it was, we all have, our National Archives isn't exactly like the Library of Congress, and obviously the Smithsonian is a collection of museums, which is a slightly different, institution and requirements. Dr. Hayden is the Library of Congress, so she's in the legislative branch, so Congress is a special clientele of hers. In a way that's slightly different from the archives or the Smithsonian. But I think we all had very similar values and beliefs, which was we were here for all Americans. We were doing these jobs in a way that was nonpartisan and welcoming to all. And we wanted to get as many people in the door as possible and try to engage as many people as possible in creative and in different ways. And we planned a lot of things together. And certainly both of them, I'm so grateful for how they treated me. And then also, by extension, offering to me that if I ever had a problem that I needed to talk to, that I could pick up the phone and call either one of them, because it's a different job. It's not like you could call, like the Secretary of Transportation, and say, hey, Pete Buttigieg, what would you do in this, I have this really thorny, problem. He would be like, he's in a different position. He was, certainly from in President Biden's cabinet, but he's a political, operative in that position. And neither myself nor Dr. Hayden or Secretary Bunch viewed ourselves in that same way. We're like almost unicorns in that way. And so it was very comforting to know that we each had each other's backs, I would say.
So I'm going to follow up on another thread about this question, which is that when I first started doing research at the Smithsonian, and I also want to say we've like Library of Congress, Smithsonian, National Archives, and Library of Congress.
Okay.
We've got a whole bunch of
Trifecta.
connections here. I started doing research in the paleobiology department, and famously, there's this Cooper room, which is the main seminar room, and like many other cultural institutions in the area, there was a line of large armchairs and then photos of all the chairs of paleobiology. Of course, just the line of men and then the chairs. That's true in many of our universities as well. I think when I started here at Maryland, only 30% of full professors were women. So when I was at the archives recently with students, we had the pleasure of seeing your portrait on the wall. So what did that mean to you, and how do you sort of think about that legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy every time that someone says, that Colleen was the first woman to serve as the Archivist of the United States. I always say, well, I'm the first, I will not be the last, for sure. So I take great pride in that. But, when I would be out and especially if I was at an event like this, or there was a lot of either library professionals or archival professionals in the audience, if I was speaking somewhere across the United States or somewhere in Washington, D.C., there would be a request, to have a photo line. And so we would end up doing the photo line. We did this with Carla Hayden a lot. I know Kate's over here, Kate's Ward, my friend. We remember, I think both of us probably worked several photo lines with Carla Hayden at one time or the other. And, what always impressed me was almost the entire line was women. And when I would ask them, and they would all say almost uniformly, I really want my picture with you because you're the first woman to serve as the Archivist of the United States. And I think until recently, until maybe the past, 8 to 10 years or so, the profession is dominated numerically by women. I mean, there's more librarians that are women, there's archivists that are women. Certainly at the National Archives, that was the case impressionistically, and certainly at the Library of Congress. But the people that ran those institutions, not just the archives and the LOC, but I'm talking about large public libraries across the United States and things like that, were almost uniformly men. And this happens all the time. This is when I took a sociology course on the history of labor and women at work. This is, very, very common where women dominate a field numerically, but men are usually in the positions of leadership in those fields. And that was the case for quite a long time until the past decade, when you started to see women who are now in these positions and roles. That's super important because we want women who are in the field, right, to see these examples and say that I can, certainly, if I want to, I can serve at these highest levels. I too can ascend to leadership positions, and there's not these barriers these impossible barriers that are in place. So I took it very seriously. There were a couple instances when I was the archivist where there were issues that researchers who were women came to me with some of the experiences that they had at the National Archives, and and brought their specific experiences to me. And I can tell you, we fixed the problem. That was for sure. I mean, I was not going to have research rooms that, in any way, shape, or form weren't welcoming to everybody that was there, but, certainly our female researchers that were coming in to do their work.
So switching gears to a different barriers of scale. So while you were at the National Archives, you oversaw a kind of increased desire for digitized materials, and the archives are scaling up their efforts to meet that demand. For the audience, for folks who don't know about this, the National Archives has something around 13.5 billion pages of records, 450 million feet of film. Our own Doug Ord, I think, calculated something like 275 years to digitize all the stuff that you have even just now, not to mention all the incoming electronic and other records. So what were your approaches and innovations to dealing with the barriers of scale? And what do you see as kind of useful for thinking about the future of access?
Well, I was lucky that the National Digitization Center, which is in the Archives 2 College Park, Maryland facility, was already underway when I became the archivist. So the only thing that I could do was continue to make sure it was funded and continue to make sure the construction was going forward. And I would check on it when I would go over to Archives 2, make sure the project was moving along. And we did open that facility when I was the archivist in I believe, 2024. We had a nice ceremony and opened it up. And there were, I think, at least that time, 3 very high volume scanners that were there. And we also found the money to hire 60 archives, digital archives technicians that worked full time in that space, of which they prepared documents for 4 days and scanned documents for 1 day because of how much time it takes to prepare some of the particular records or documents because of paper clips, and this and that, and before it would go through the machine. So that was kind of the work breakdown. Now, if we had more funding, and then I could have had more people there, right? And if I had twice the number of people, we could have been scanning twice the number of days because, Group A would have been working on this group, and Group B would have been working on this group. So that is a whole other question about the funding for the National Archives and is probably the biggest problem that the National Archives faces. So digitization is one thing. And the reason why I was pro-digitization is access. I mean, that's why I was pro-digitization. Because when I would travel around and I started to get the sense of things, oh, I'm over here in this part of the country, but the record I need is all the way across the other side of the country because there's National Archives facilities, not just in Washington, D.C., but they're distributed throughout the United States. So the only way in which we can make access, more attainable for most Americans who don't all have, flush research funds to travel all over the place to see these materials is through responsible digitization. So access was really the reason why I wanted to digitize and also working on the catalog because the catalog had its own challenges. The more you put in the National Archives catalog, the online catalog, the harder it had become to locate what you were actually searching for. So I put a great deal of as much money as I could find into trying to figure out ways and working with our innovation team to figure out how we could improve the search in the catalog. Because it's great to digitize things, it's great to put it in the catalog, but if you can't find it, I mean, what in the heck is the point? You got to be able to find it. And once again, that was me as a user, because I would go searching for things and I'd be like, well, why can't I find, the patent for Barbie? When the Barbie movie came out, I knew we had the patent for the Barbie. Why can't I find the patent for the Barbie in the catalog, right? So we would use these different test cases to try to figure out how we could implement technology solutions to try to improve the search in the catalog. But then the other issue, which is the bigger issue, okay, so you have the digitization thing and on a better path with the National Digitization Center and everything that's been built and constructed there. But the real problem is not digitization. That is not what kept me up at night. That was not what, would be the thing in the back of my brain. It's the born digital records. That is the real challenge because you have 13.5 billion. So that's like a number. And eventually that number is going to decrease as you start, and then you start improving with technology and digitization. But you are going to be overwhelmed with a tsunami of born digital or electronic records. They're going to be coming the National Archives way as those born digital records work their way through the various record schedules. It's going to go from the millions to the billions and then eventually into the trillions. And what the National Archives did not have was the system of systems built that could accession those records at that volume, that could provide a workspace for archivists to work with those digital records, to make them accessible. And then, of course, the application that would enable the public to search for those records and then use them and view them on their computer or their phone wherever they were at. So none of the 3 stages of that system of systems was built. And when I figured that out, and I was like, oh no, this is a problem. This is a really big problem. And we're going to need, resources to do this. I can't just, I can't MacGyver this. I don't know what else to say about it, right? I can't like put two toothpicks together and create it. We're going to have to get some resources to be able to do it. And that's what became really my focus for a good portion of my tenure as archivist. And doing that by talking to members of Congress and talking to the White House, which they got it, to their credit, the Biden White House. They understood it. I was able to talk to the Office of Management and Budget. They understood it. They put money into the president's budget for it. And then it was my job to sell it to the Hill. And that was what I was really doing and where I spent a lot of my time.
All right. So a bit of a pivot to thinking about NARA and nonpartisanship. So your time as archivist was shorter than many of us expected or hoped, probably you most of all. And before you were fired, there had been public reporting by ABC News that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was filling the role of acting archivist without any official announcement being made. And also, while he had quite a number of other roles in the administration, he stepped down from the role of acting archivist just a few weeks ago in compliance with the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. He tapped Jim Byron, formerly of the Nixon Presidential Library, to take on these duties. And NARA is currently still without a Senate-confirmed archivist, and the role of deputy archivist is likewise vacant. Are you concerned about how the role of archivist is being treated by the Trump administration, given just the scope of the role that you did, and also this huge challenge of born digital records that you just mentioned?
Well, I mean, I think, just by having some of the discussion that we've had so far, I think you can tell that this was an all-encompassing job. I mean, it was not a 9-to-5 job. It was not like a 2-day-a-week job or a 3-day-a-week job. It was a 7-day-a-week job, for sure. I think, I definitely got Thanksgiving off, and I think, had Christmas off. But those might have really literally been the only days in which I was not on my phone or I wasn't doing something, related to the National Archives. I would wake up in the morning and say, okay, how are we gonna move the ball today? What's the game plan? What are we doing to advance the mission of the National Archives, to provide for access to the American people, of course, to help the staff at the National Archives? Like, what are we going to do to advance this mission and strategy forward today? And that's what I woke up in the morning at 5:30 a.m. thinking, and probably the last thing that I thought of before I fell asleep at night. So you need someone, okay? You need someone who is in the job that's what they're thinking, right, all day long. Someone that will advocate for the institution, that will advocate for the mission, that will advocate for the records themselves and the perpetuation of the records. And that is what is absolutely what you want. So I would argue that I think that we need a full-time archivist of the United States. Of course, in the statute, it's very explicit that this person should not be chosen, I guess you could say nominated, should not be nominated for political purposes. This person should be nominated based upon his or her qualifications alone. That is because the Archivist of the United States, much like we've talked about the Librarian of Congress, and is a little bit different, it goes through a political process for that nomination, but then acts independently once that person is in the position and the job. So I would hope for not just a nominee to be the Archivist of the United States, but someone that does fulfill those requirements outlined in the statute.
And if I can follow up, things that might be keeping us up at night. Do you ever worry that there won't be a formal appointment of a new archivist before the end of the administration? Are you concerned about where White House records will go?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. I have no insights on what the White House is planning. So I just don't know. It's not something that I think about because it's just unknowable to me right now. But I mean, I will say at the end of an administration, okay, So at the end of the Biden administration, when I was the archivist, we spent a lot of time on the transfer of records, the legal transfer of records, presidential records, from the Biden administration to the National Archives, both the physical records of the Biden administration, as well as, of course, the born digital records. Both of them are presidential records. It really doesn't matter the format in which they are presented. And I spent a lot of time with the council at the National Archives. At that time was a career government employee, a longtime career government employee. And he worked very closely with the White House counsel about that, because that's where a lot of the records, of course, the Presidential Records Act, so you have White House counsel that's overseeing the execution and fulfillment of the Presidential Records Act. So the general counsel at the archives, talking with White House counsel, they brought a lot of materials to me, a lot that we would have to review. And I mean, towards the end, as we marched down to the end, towards January 20th, every day checking in to make sure that transfer was going as planned and would be executed on January 20th. There are some records that are created in the White House that are personal records, and it's outlined by law why those records are personal records and not presidential records. It's very explicit. And then there's sometimes records that are duplicate records that then don't need to be transferred. And so there were some duplications of records that the Biden administration was going to submit for, not for the National Archives, but for destruction. And I will tell you, I went over that with a fine-tooth comb with our general counsel, like, okay, so why are these ones duplicates? Like, tell me why. No, don't just tell me they are. I want to know why they're duplicates, because there was no way on my watch were we going to be, destroying records that, I wanted to make sure everything came over. And then they would go into great detail to explain to me, yes, okay, so these are duplicates because this information is also stored over here. So this is why these records will be destroyed, but the information is transmitted in these other records that will come to the National Archives. So I would mark up these letters and I would say, explain this, explain that. That's the scrutiny that you need. That is what you want. That is your job as the Archivist of the United States to be on that and make sure that transfer occurs properly. And I had great confidence, obviously, in my general counsel who was doing that, because he was a career employee at the National Archives. He was a nonpartisan careerist, and he had done it other times. He had been through this. He was explaining it to me for the first time, but he had been through this before. Unfortunately, now there's a political person who is in that role and not a careerist. And, things like that start to make me a little bit concerned, because once again, the advocacy should be for the records themselves and the preservation of the records themselves, not any particular political outcome.
Actually, you can go to the next question.
So actually, I think one of the questions we wanted to ask riffs on this a little bit, but also on something that I think a lot of our students and a lot of professional archivists talk about a lot, which is this idea like archives are not neutral. And of course, archives are not neutral usually means archives are the products of the people, the times, the context, the power dynamics of a particular time and dynamic that created them. But how do you think about that in contrast with this important messaging around archives are nonpartisan in the sort of political context of the United States? And what do you mean by that? What do you think of as the difference? And what does the public need to understand about the management and governance of our documentary or primary source resources?
It's a great question. And it's a little bit of a nuanced question, but it's an important one to ask. So I agree, archives are not neutral. I actually don't really like that word, neutrality. It's the same way, I would say like the Congressional Research Service wasn't neutral. We never described CRS as neutral. We used objective methodologies in social science, for example, to come to conclusions about policy or institutional evaluations. But it wasn't, I wouldn't use neutrality as a way to describe that. And certainly, listen, records are a product of their time, right? And, we see this over and over and over again. A great example, easy example is African-American genealogy, which is, can be very, very challenging and difficult because the records just, are at a certain point stop. And so the ability for families to be able to really understand some of their origins is limited by the records and limited, by the way, by the racism that infected how we kept records at that particular moment in time. But that being said, the National Archives is a nonpartisan federal government institution, is how I would say. And I can't speak for other archives. I'm talking about the National Archives. And nonpartisan, what that means is that as the Archivist of the United States and also as the people working at the National Archives, you apply the law in a nonpartisan way. The Federal Records Act, the Presidential Records Act, no matter, you apply that law the same to whatever party is doesn't matter what party is in power, who's controlling Congress, who's asking for the records. There is not any political bias or favoritism in how you execute that access and the laws and regulations that govern access to those records and the presentation of those records. So I find that nonpartisan descriptor to be, I think, addressing something different than the concept of neutrality.
I'm going to sort of pull on a related thread. In the last year, we've seen unprecedented pressure, I think it's fair to say, from the White House on universities, federal agencies, researchers, and many others to shift our research, our programming, our exhibitions to accord with new presidential priorities and a narrower view of what American history is. Both Diana and I, and indeed many colleagues at UMD and our students have been directly impacted by the termination of congressionally appropriated research grants. And we've watched in horror as our federal cultural heritage colleagues and others are pressured to change their ways of working, their exhibition narratives, their collecting policies, their daily operations. And of course, many have lost their jobs. Before the cuts came, some people were asking themselves, how can I change how I talk or how I write or how I do my research or present this exhibit so that I can keep things going? And others were saying there's no way that I can change what I'm doing and toe this new line. How did you, while you were at NARA, wrestle with these questions? And I'm thinking about the American Story exhibit, which I think just launched after, just recently. What are the consequences of bending current narratives to current political moments rather than having transcending administrations, shall we say?
Right. I mean, that is where I benefited from, I will say this, I benefited from my experience. It might be really hard to come into one of these jobs if you hadn't had the benefit of 15 years of training beforehand in various roles, like at the Library of Congress, at the White House Historical Association, both terrific institutions that also describe themselves as nonpartisan. And I certainly saw, for example, with exhibits, many exhibits. I was involved in the formation of many exhibits at the Library of Congress and watched how those exhibits were formulated, how the Library of Congress presented material. Right before I went to the archives, I just had finished the first pass of the new exhibit that the White House Historical Association opened at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, this awesome digitally interactive exhibit that tells the history of the White House and its collections. So I'd gone through the process at yet another organization. So I would say, I knew my job as I had inherited, the outlines of that exhibit, the American Story exhibit, from my predecessor and the different rooms, but there wasn't any specificity to it. Like, what are we going to show? How are we going to fill this out? How are we going to tell the narrative? And I'm thankful that I had that experience to be able to do it. That exhibit in particular is meant to last 20 years at the National Archives. It would cost a fair amount of money. And the previous exhibit had lasted 20 years. It was a little out of date at the end, but it lasted 20 years. When you're dealing with a public institution like that, and you're going to make a high dollar investment, you have to make sure that it can't be ephemeral. It can't be in for 2 or 3 years and then you're going to change it. So we were very, very cognizant that we were creating an exhibit that was going to last. It was going to be impervious to politics in a way, because presidential administrations were going to come and go. Who knows who was going to be in the White House, what was going to happen. But we were going to be telling the story of the American story through the National Archives and its records in a way that would hopefully last, for a long period of time. And I also wanted to show as much of American history as possible. If we're talking about a story in the David Rubenstein Gallery on the first floor, I didn't necessarily want to replicate that same era or history in another exhibit as well. So I spent a lot of time on it, very, very careful, very cognizant that this would be something that would certainly, I didn't know my tenure was going to be that short, but I thought that it would, certainly outlast me. I mean, it was going to outlast me as the archivist. So that's a good way to be thinking of it. And I will say I saw the exhibit probably about a month ago. I went to see my portrait, which was, exciting. And I went to see the exhibit, and I was really proud of it. I mean, it is the exhibit that I worked on for sure. It was not changed appreciably after I left the National Archives. So I think it couldn't have been, because they would have never been able to get it done in that period of time. The Wall Street Journal, who had criticized the exhibit when even though it hadn't even actually ever been, there was no exhibit to see, wrote this amazing review of the exhibit, which I thought was really, that was kind of like a surreal moment, that they had changed their mind so much, and called it actually a great example of civic education in Washington, D.C. So I'm glad that it's open, and I'm glad that millions of Americans are going to get the chance to go through it.
Following on that, you've been very busy in the last year. So a number of us are really enamored of your current projects, and we're wondering if you could talk a little bit about More Perfect and other things you're working on now that have taken some of that enthusiasm you had for that kind of mission to the work that you're doing now, and maybe about this current set of essays and the first essay that dropped this Monday.
So after I left the National Archives, I thought I would take, some time off, because you can tell, like, this was kind of a tough job, and I'd been through a bit in my life. So I thought maybe I would take about 6 months off and just, I'd never done that before, but maybe I'd take some time off. And that was kind of the plan. But then this organization, More Perfect, which I had known of when I was at White House Historical, and I think even before that, certainly when I was at the Archives, John Bridgeland, who worked for President Bush, he ran USA Freedom Corps for President Bush and the Domestic Policy Council in the early years. He runs More Perfect, and it's a bipartisan alliance of presidential foundations, presidential centers, presidential sites, and civic organizations all across the country. He called, and along with Mark Updegrove from the LBJ Foundation and Anita McBride, who was Laura Bush's chief of staff when she was First Lady, and they said, we have this new project, and what we want to do for 2026, we have some money for it, is that we want to recruit prominent people to write essays, short essays on the presidents and first ladies. And we want to try to figure out what are the lessons from American history we can learn from these individuals, successes, failures, not whitewashing things, but, the good, bad, and the ugly. What can we learn from these leaders, and how can it be relevant to our lives today and the next 250 years in the United States? Well, I mean, that was one of, I loved the presidency. I also, when I was at White House Historical, I loved the first ladies. That's where I really got exposed to learning about the history of first ladies and a lot of their stories. So this really played to a lot of my strengths. And I knew that More Perfect was just the type of organization that I wanted to be affiliated with. They're pro-democracy. They have 5 pillars of democracy that they're working on. This is part of pillar number 1, civic education for all Americans. I thought, well, gosh, maybe I could do this, and I could still be part of America's 250th, commemoration and celebration if we built this project. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So I came on board, and we just started building this project out, and we renamed it. It's called In Pursuit. And this has been a very big week because In Pursuit debuted on Monday, on President's Day, and we started publishing these very short essays on our presidents. We're starting with George Washington and going through chronologically. And President Bush wrote the essay on George Washington. This it was published this week. And the historian Karen Wolf from Brown University, early American historian, wrote the essay on Martha Washington. And boy, did that make a splash. It turns out that people are really interested in George Washington and what George Bush has to say about George Washington. And the lesson that President Bush put forward was why humility is important in our leadership today. And he wrote an essay using George Washington as illustrating the importance of humility and also the limitations of executive power and why Washington's humility enabled him to reject power at times, which by the way, ironically made Washington more powerful, if you really understand it. And then Karen wrote a great essay about Martha Washington, stepping into the void and creating this whole, it wasn't called First Lady, but creating this role for women. And how did she face that challenge? And looking at her life, holistically, and I think fairly from many different aspects. And we have had over 1 million social media impressions this week. I don't think there's a media outlet that hasn't covered the debut of these essays. And okay, so it's good that George Bush kicked us off, and we're going to have President Obama and all the former first ladies, Laura Bush and Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton and President Clinton. They're all going to write essays. Chief Justice Roberts. So we're going to have a number of really impressive people, plus Pulitzer Prize-winning historians, writing these essays throughout the project. But I think what has gotten people excited is they just want to learn about history. I mean, people like American history. It's exciting. It's interesting. There's a lot of stories in American history. And we've designed these essays that you can read them with your coffee in the morning. It takes you maybe 10 minutes to read the essay, or you could do it at night before you go to bed or anywhere in between. And I think we're just going to get as many Americans as possible to come along with us. And let's forget, a lot of the ideology. Let's forget a lot of this baggage. And let's just try to learn American history together and once again, have some fun with it.
I love the old school nature of like the series of essays.
Yeah,
it's really fun.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We need essays right now.
Right.
So you've done this lovely pivot and didn't get your time off, it sounds like.
No, not too much.
That sounds like
I had a week, I think, or something like where I actually had some time off.
our gain, I think. But I wonder if you can reflect, I know we have in the audience people who have left federal service, who have been incredible federal servants. We have folks who are still doing the work. Thank you all. And we wonder if you've got any advice for those who are trying to repurpose their public service ethic and those who might be still in the trenches. Any words of wisdom there?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add to that also for our students who are looking at the horizon of maybe next year entering into this exciting landscape. Any advice for them too?
Sure. So I would say that I've been a federal employee for not all of my career, but a good portion of it, and so it was a little bit of a challenge at first. I mean, just psychologically and mentally to start to make that pivot. But I was lucky enough to find an organization whose values were so close and so aligned with my own. When I went to the first big public meeting that More Perfect had assembled with a lot of these presidential sites and foundations that they brought together actually at Mount Vernon, I was a little nervous because, I mean, it just was like, oh, I'm no longer the Archivist of the United States. How am I going to feel in this group? What's going to happen? And I walked in that room and I felt nothing but, like a great warm embrace, because I think there's a lot of excitement going on in the nonprofit world these days. And the nonprofit world feels a sense of responsibility to try to figure out, I mean, obviously you can't replicate the federal government, but to try to find ways in which the nonprofit world can step up and can make a difference and can, in some ways, in some instances, help fill in certain gaps that exist. So I have had a very positive experience in that way, and I know other people. It's a very difficult. It can be very challenging and difficult because there were other people that were let go, after me at the National Archives. Luckily, they've now all found at this point in time employment or reemployment. So that's really great, but we walked, down that path together in many instances. If you are still in federal employment and service, you should, hopefully you're able to go to work every day and you are able to do your job. I think that, at the end of this, there's going to be a lot of stories that will probably be written about the people that did continue to go to work and did the best that they could and continue to show up, continue to serve the public, continue to execute on that mission in every way, shape that they could. And so I think those people are extraordinarily heroic and should be commended for, you're a public servant. So in the end, you're working for the American people and your allegiance is to the Constitution, right? That's how I always viewed it, because that's the oath of office that you take, is to the Constitution. And I took that very, very seriously. And for younger people, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And my advice on this is, there might be opportunities for federal service coming up. It's hard to say, like with the budgetary situation, whether entities, or agencies will be hiring or not. But there's a lot of an exodus in the federal service, and there is still work that needs to be done. And so there may be opportunities actually for federal employment that will be coming up in the next couple of years. And then I think that really just is up to you. Like, is this do I want to take advantage of the opportunity that presents itself because these jobs are available and I want to do this, or no, or at this moment in time, that's that particular avenue, even though I would like to explore it at some point in my career, that avenue is not the right one for me right now. But I will go and I will get my skills somewhere else and, get experience somewhere else, with the idea that maybe someday I will come into federal service. I will follow that path. I mean, my career is not like a linear career per se. I mean, it was like, a lot of twists and turns, once described to me as diagonal moves rather than, like vertical moves, or horizontal or diagonal moves. I had a lot of diagonal moves. So, I mean, you can also plan it that way, that I can, get some experience over here that will enable me then when I start my federal career, I won't be starting at at an entry-level position. I'll actually be starting maybe at a mid-level position, because you will have that experience that will enable you to do that. So it really is up to you and what you feel comfortable with and what your own trajectory is.
I think now we're going to start with our audience questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you everyone for passing in your questions. We have tried to collate some of them that are of the same topics. So we can get through as much material as possible. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Fenlon, to get us started.
Okay, I'm going to try to braid together several questions on the theme of AI and archives, born digital archives. So in an era where there's just continuing growth of digitized and born digital materials, and now also the relatively new challenge of AI generated and inflected content, digital content being exchanged through messaging platforms.
Yep.
What are the policy and cultural shifts that are needed to prevent gaps in the historical record?
Okay, to prevent gaps in the historical record, I'm trying, well, I mean, I think that AI poses a lot of unique questions for places like, you know, the National Archives, because I mean, my biggest concern would be substitute records or fake records, or I don't know how to describe it, that are not real, but they are describing themselves as being real. And so it's going to be very important for these institutions to develop ways, and I know I'm not a, you know, a technology wizard, but to find ways in which to verify digital records so that there will be a way to know that this is, just for lack of an example, this is a National Archives photograph of, you know, President Obama or President Eisenhower versus a constructed record that is not found in the presidential records or the presidential libraries. There's going to have to be a way in which there will be verification in order to do that, to give authenticity and to also inspire confidence and legitimacy. Because archives really, I mean, that's the whole point, right, is to provide legitimacy of, not that you necessarily agree with the decisions of the American government, but you have the records that are transparently provided to you so that you have that degree of accountability and then, of course, legitimacy. Now, I mean, our artificial intelligence in general, we are, you know, finding our information in ways that is going to be, I can't even imagine what it's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years down the road. We know that this technology is moving at an exponential pace, and people are going to get used to locating information in a way in which they query the record and have an ongoing conversation with records and information, rather than how we've all been taught, which is doing various descriptions of search. So when I was the archivist, I mean, you know, we developed a pilot project with AI on a very small set of records from the JFK assassination, from the Warren Commission records, because they were digitized and they were something that Americans knew about, right? And something that would generate interest. And they were a defined group of records, like a small amount, 200,000 pages or 250,000 pages, something like that. It was a closed AI system. And we developed it. It was called Archie. That was the name of it. We gave it a kind of cute name. And really, at the end of my tenure, we were getting ready to deploy Archie for just beta, just a test. And not saying that had all kinds of things on it. Do not, you know, when you query this is not, you know, this is for test purposes. This is to learn how the AI queries work and things like that. You should not take this and then put it in your research paper, right? You know, this was for these purposes only. And, you know, every iteration I saw of Archie as we worked on it got better and better. I mean, because we go back, I think it was Microsoft that was working with us on it, and go back and get more information, and it would perform better when we would test it. We tested it with some trusted people outside the archives before. And then unfortunately, after I left, that project got killed. And I thought that was unfortunate. So it never made it out to the public it was going to be a 1-month beta that we were going to collect information about it. And I think that was a mistake, because how else are we going to learn how to use these tools without dipping our toe in the water very cautiously, once again, and learning how people were using it so that then you could apply that methodology eventually to larger quantities of information and larger volumes of records.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We have a few questions that all continue with this thread of trustworthiness, but also trustworthiness vis-a-vis mis and disinformation. Several of the questions ask in a TikTok-heavy era of mis and disinformation being spread, what role do archives play there? Of course, these questions also, you already alluded to the JFK assassination papers, but the fact that some of the most well-known collections in the National Archives are still at the center of conspiracy theories. And then finally,
UAEs, yeah.
right.
I spent a lot of time on UAEs.
And, finally in this thread of mis and disinformation, the role of the archives when a government attempts to purposefully conceal records and material. That's a lot of ground.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I like to quote, I don't know, from Hermione Granger. I mean, when in doubt, go to the library, right? You could say, when in doubt, go to the archive too. It works, she didn't say that, but I think Hermione would agree on that one. So, yes, I mean, there's a lot out. I mean, there's so much out there, and there's no way that the National Archives or any institution can police everything that's out there on TikTok and all those other types of things. What I would say, what we did do pretty successfully when I was the archivist was we grew a social media team, and and the Library of Congress did this really, really well, and still is doing it very, very well. We grew a social media team and said, we've got to be out there we've got to dive right in, and we've got to create short videos using the records, telling the story of the records in hopefully entertaining and interesting ways, so that we can also be in the conversation out there. So hopefully when people see things that maybe aren't truthful, they'll also see us. They'll see the National Archives, and they will say, oh, maybe I need to check this out. Maybe this is the resource in which I can actually find out whether this is true or whether this is not true. So I mean, I think that you've got to play the game a little bit, and this is really important for libraries, archives, and museums to be as aggressive as possible in their public outreach, including on these online platforms, so that they can not really combat it, but they can also engage and remind people of that we're there. And yes, I mean, in governments, I mean, there's a lot of examples, of course, of governments restricting access to the archives, or in some cases, actually changing records. I just was reading about this a while ago about the Soviet Union actually changing all kinds of, removing people from photographs and all kinds of different things. And also reading about the flip side, though, like South Africa. One way in which South Africa, after apartheid, was able to try to restore legitimacy in its government was to open up the archives, right? And encourage South Africans to come and do research at the archives and look at the records so they could understand the history of their families, and in some cases, people that were incarcerated unfairly. And so those stories were thrown open. So that was a way for the South African government to reestablish and restore that legitimacy. So we have to, there's stories on both sides. There is no doubt, I think for a long period of time, I wanted to make sure I got this in here, so I'll do it with this question. When I was at the Library of Congress, we viewed ourselves as the nation's preeminent cultural institution. We use that language a lot. Maybe a little bit under Billington, but certainly a lot under Carla Hayden. And I think, and at the archives, probably when I came, I probably thought of it in sort of a similar vein, but I don't think of it that way quite as much anymore. It's fine to describe those institutions as, I don't disagree with that, but I would also say that the stronger description is we are, as archives and libraries, are necessary components of a democratic government. We need to start attaching the description of archives and libraries as essential building blocks of democracy. These are not institutions that are afterthoughts. These are not things that are nice to have, that should just be the rounding error in our federal budgets or things like that. They are the infrastructure that enables democracy to function and function well. And we need to start treating them that way. So I have changed my way in which I talk about these institutions slightly because I think we need that stronger vocabulary going forward when we think about them.
I saw a bunch of thumbs up in the back.
Yeah, very tempted to let that be the mic drop. That was but we'll take all the time we can get. So continuing on the theme of public trust in these institutions, as institutions like archives and libraries come under threat, how can we best advocate for their support?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it is a challenge because there's so many things, right, that are going on in the world. We have challenges with our immigration policies, with healthcare provisions, with foreign policy. We have and these are not just in this administration. These are perennial problems that we have. And these policy problems affect people's lives in dramatic and real ways, and we know that. And so the challenge of archives and libraries is it's really hard to make, as much as everybody in this room, this is our career, this is our profession, we've all worked in these institutions. It's hard to get that above the fold, newspaper headline about the future of archives and libraries. It's hard to compete with some of these other really big challenges that we face in the United States or we face as a global community. And that was hard for me, even as the archivist, because when I would talk to members of Congress, they would say, yes, you're making a lot of sense. Like no one ever said, really, we don't need this. No one ever said that to me. People always listened to my spiel. People always agreed with me. They might have agreed, about the funding level. We had to go back and forth, but never disagreed with my argument that these things were important. But you got to remember, and I understood this implicitly, members of Congress have like 85 million people like chirping at them in their ear about what's important to them. And are they getting emails? Are they getting letters? Are they getting phone calls at the level of archives and library funding and the future of the National Archives as compared to some of these other issues? No, they're not. And so, some of the best members of Congress said to me, we've got to come up with some case studies. Like, please, let's work on some case studies that I can take to the subcommittee, members, that I can take to other members of the Appropriations Committee, and I can say, if we don't have this, this is affecting real people's lives. And of course, we had that for veterans records, and we had it for a few other cases, but we were also in the process of trying to work with some members to construct these types of case studies. But what you can do is be very vocal with your elected representatives and say, don't forget about these issues. Please don't forget about them. Become as active in your own local community with your own local libraries or your own local archives. I tell people across the United States, and try to explain to people, it's like the oxygen in the air. Right? We all get up in the morning and I guarantee you don't think about like, oh, isn't it great that we're breathing oxygen today, right? You just get up and you go, right? Because the oxygen in the air is there. But what if you woke up one morning and the oxygen in the air wasn't there? Well, you would pretty much know. You would know it because you wouldn't be able to breathe. And that's the same thing. Libraries and archives are like the oxygen in the air. They have operated effectively. Places like the Library of Congress and the National Archives have operated effectively for centuries and decades. And if we don't take care of them, one day, we'll wake up and they won't be there. They won't be serving the same role that they've been serving, and that will affect the operation of our democracy. So we have to nip that in the bud. We can't have that moment happen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, make sure that you call so frequently about the IMLS that you get to know the operators at your congressperson. Not that I have that relationship with them yet. All right. Thank you so much for this answer. I want to actually go back, and this will be our last question, to something that you opened your talk with here today. And that was about that really interesting relationship between academia and practice. And I think it's something that we think about a lot here. I see, especially looking at a room full of many of our students who are wondering, I think you answered a really great question about, the spirit of how we do work in a particularly difficult moment. But I think they're also thinking about, and they're asking about, what advice you have for them in terms of what skills they need to be able to bring to the field right now, whether that is specifically as archivists or as other nonpartisan federal employees. What skills are we looking for in that workforce now as we look ahead to the future?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, when I started out as a, I guess comparatively young than I am now, first line manager, a place like the Congressional Research Service, I naively thought that the idea was that I should hire the smartest people that I could find, for the jobs that I had opened, and so that was my goal. And yeah, certainly you want people that are well educated and well trained, but certainly that that viewpoint of what I was looking for had changed over time. We want people, like I said, that are well prepared, but we really need people that know how to work together, work collaboratively. They can demonstrate those types of skills. We can teach you all kinds of, great things, on the job. And most people that come our way, come your way are going to be intelligent and capable. But there is a particular way of how you do your work and the spirit in which you do your work. And that, when, by the time you're in your 20s and 30s, that is kind of a little bit difficult to teach someone, the ability to work well in a group setting and to work collaboratively. And I think that's a really important skill. Ambition and curiosity are really important. So you come in and you'll have to do a particular job, and you should do that job really well. But how can you help other people that are around you do their job, and are you interested in what their work is as well? That curiosity. Can you problem solve in a way that when a problem presents itself, you can go to your supervisor and say, hey, I have this problem. I have a solution for it. Can I run it by you, right? Rather than just taking a problem to your supervisor and saying, I don't know exactly what to do. I mean, it's okay to do that as well. But if you have that idea for how you might approach that problem and have that knack for problem solving, that's really important, I think, in most environments. So, and coming at it with a spirit of inclusivity, and like I said, a spirit of collaboration, that's going to be very important, and how you demonstrate that when you interview for the jobs, and to be able to cite specific examples in which you've done that, either in your educational career or in your internships or any of the experiences that you've had here at the University of Maryland. The more you're able to tell those stories and explain yourself and demonstrate it, the better off you'll be. But wow, what a great field to be in, because I can guarantee you this, as much as great as your education is here today, the field won't be the same, like I said, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, certainly not 20, 25, or 30 years from now, as you're hitting the pinnacle or arc of your career. But many of the principles that you are taught here, the ethical principles and the principles of information science, archival science, or library science, those principles will be the same. They will be consistent. How you apply them will be different. But thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you so much to Diana and Victoria. This has been such a wonderful evening, and I wish you absolutely the best of luck.
Thank you for validating all our group projects. I heard group projects. Was there any last thing you wanted to make sure folks heard before we left?
Oh, no, I mean, the only thing I would say, if you want to follow along, with the current project, we're on, the project is based out of Substack, so it's called In Pursuit. Or if you're not on Substack, you can just go to our website, inpursuit.org, and you can follow along on the website and all the social media, In Pursuit USA. And, we're going to be coming at you all the way from now till December, really interesting, exciting ways to think about history and not necessarily agree with the essays, but engage in respectful and reasonable debate about them.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Thank you so much for coming and
Thank
giving
you.
us a lot of excitement and renewed aspirations for our
Yes.
archival students.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
all.